When successful businessman Richard Hale vanished one rainy night in Bridgevale, everyone believed he had drowned in despair. His elegant wife, Elaine Hale, grieved with perfect composure, winning the town's sympathy while quietly collecting millions in life insurance. Months later, a burned cabin, a mystery corpse, and a missing contractor named Mark Denton shattered the illusion of tragedy. What began as a disappearance soon twisted into a web of greed, deceit, and betrayal that reached far beyond the riverbank. Years later, when Richard resurfaced alive in a distant town, the truth emerged. A staged death, a double cross, and a killer still on the loose. With Elaine gone without a trace and Mark found buried in the woods, Bridgevale learned a brutal lesson. The perfect crime doesn't exist, only the illusion of one waiting to fall apart. The rain had started before dawn, a steady drizzle that turned the narrow streets of Bridgevale slick and gray. When the first few shopkeepers opened their doors that morning, they noticed something unusual. Richard Hale's silver sedan still parked by the riverside. It wasn't strange for cars to be left there overnight, but this one stood out. The doors were locked, the keys sat in the ignition, and his phone lay on the passenger seat, screen dark, battery drained. Within hours, whispers began to move through the town like a chill breeze. Richard Hale, one of Bridgevale's most successful businessmen, was missing. He had been the kind of man people trusted, polite, sharp, and always dressed in crisp suits. His company, Hale Industries, dealt in construction materials and had recently won a major government contract. On the night before he vanished, Richard had stayed late in his office, according to security logs. Cameras captured him leaving the building around 10:43 p.m., carrying a briefcase and wearing his gray overcoat. He waved to the guard, got into his car, and drove off toward the river road. That was the last confirmed sighting. Police began a full search within hours. They combed through the riverbank, bringing in dogs and divers. They dragged the water for days, hoping to find a body or at least some sign of struggle. But nothing surfaced. The car was clean, no fingerprints other than Richard's. There was no evidence of violence, no blood, and no signs of forced entry. The river currents were strong that week, so investigators initially believed he had taken his own life. But those who knew him didn't believe that for a second. Richard was ambitious, maybe even proud, but he wasn't the kind of man to give up. As days turned into weeks, rumors began to take root. Some said he had been under investigation for fraud, though police never confirmed it. Others whispered that he'd had a falling out with a business partner. There were stories of secret affairs, unpaid debts, and hidden accounts. The town, usually quiet, buzzed with speculation. Every diner conversation, every gossip-filled corner revolved around the same question. Where was Richard Hale? Detectives followed every lead. They checked surveillance footage along nearby highways, interviewed his employees, and traced his financial records. That's when they found the first red flag: a series of bank transfers to unknown accounts in the months leading up to his disappearance. Large amounts of money, moved quietly just under the threshold that would trigger a federal alert. It looked calculated, almost rehearsed. But even with that discovery, there was no clear answer. His home showed no signs of preparation or departure. His passport was still inside his desk. His wife, Elaine, told police that she'd gone to bed before he came home and assumed he'd stayed late again. Her voice was steady during questioning, her tone filled with just enough sorrow to sound believable. Without a body, the police couldn't call it a crime. Without evidence, they couldn't call it suicide. Richard Hale had simply vanished, leaving behind an expensive car, a grieving wife, and a mystery that would soon prove far darker than anyone could imagine. Elaine Hale became a symbol of quiet strength in Bridgevale. In the weeks after her husband's disappearance, she maintained a calm grace that both impressed and unsettled those around her. She wore black for a month, attended every police briefing, and spoke softly whenever reporters came to her door. Her composure was almost unnerving. Neighbors expected breakdowns or public grief, but instead, Elaine presented herself as a woman at peace with tragedy. She often said Richard was beyond pain now, words that hinted at acceptance rather than hope. At first, people pitied her. She received casseroles, flowers, and cards from nearly every household in town. But as time went on, her behavior began to raise quiet suspicion. 3 months after Richard's disappearance, Elaine stopped wearing black. She sold the couple's home in Bridgevale and moved to a more expensive property near the outskirts, a bright modern house with a manicured lawn and gleaming windows. Those who drove past often slowed down, puzzled at how quickly she seemed to have rebuilt her life. Her financial situation was another surprise. Richard's company, now under temporary management, had been struggling with debts, yet Elaine seemed unaffected. Investigators later learned that she had received a massive insurance payout, nearly $2 million, granted after a judge declared Richard legally dead. The paperwork had gone through smoothly, perhaps too smoothly given that his body had never been found. The policy itself was suspiciously recent, signed just 2 weeks before Richard disappeared. When detectives checked the signature, it matched his perfectly. Still, something about the timing felt wrong. Elaine's public statements didn't help her case. During an interview with a local newspaper, she mentioned that Richard had seemed distant and burdened, suggesting depression. Her words supported the idea of suicide, but they contradicted everything Richard's friends had said about him. He had just expanded his company and spoken excitedly about future projects. The more Elaine insisted on his despair, the more people began to doubt her story. Detectives continued to visit her, sometimes unannounced. Each time she welcomed them politely, offering coffee and short, calm answers. Her home was spotless, her demeanor unwavering. She never slipped, never contradicted herself, never seemed nervous. Yet something about her precision felt rehearsed. One detective later described her as the calmest widow I've ever met, too calm, like she'd practiced for it. In private, Elaine began changing small details of her life. She closed Richard's office, sold his personal belongings, and canceled all joint accounts. Within months, no visible trace of him remained in her world. It was as if she had erased him completely. Still, questions lingered. Why would a woman who claimed to love her husband want the investigation shut down so quickly? Why did she discourage police from reopening the river search? When one officer mentioned extending the case into neighboring counties, Elaine's voice reportedly turned cold. "Let him rest," she said quietly, ending the conversation. Behind her calm exterior, something calculating seemed to stir. Bridgevale began to sense it, that beneath the widow's composed smile lay secrets too deep to hide forever. 6 months after Richard Hale's disappearance, the case had grown cold. Leads had dried up and public interest had begun to fade. Bridgevale slowly returned to its quiet routine, but beneath the surface, unease remained. Then one October afternoon, a group of hikers stumbled upon something in a forest 50 miles from town that reignited everything. Deep among the trees, they found a small cabin reduced to blackened timber and ash. It looked as though it had burned months ago, unnoticed and forgotten. When police arrived, they uncovered what appeared to be human remains amid the debris. Fragments of bone, scraps of clothing, and melted metal fused into the ashes. At first, no one connected the find to Richard Hale. But when investigators sifted through the debris, they recovered a partially melted wristwatch still clinging to one of the bones. The serial number etched into the backplate was barely legible, but when cleaned, it revealed something unmistakable. The watch had belonged to Richard. It was a rare model, custom-made, and one he was known to wear daily. The discovery hit the town like a thunderclap. News headlines declared that the mystery of Richard Hale was finally solved. Police theorized that he had somehow made his way to the remote forest cabin and died there in an accidental fire. Elaine gave a short, somber statement to the press saying she was grateful for closure, yet detectives weren't fully convinced. The circumstances felt too convenient, too sudden, and the cabin too far from any place Richard was known to visit. Forensic teams were called in to identify the remains. What they found changed everything. The DNA analysis produced an unexpected result. The bones didn't match Richard Hale. Instead, they belonged to another man, identity unknown. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. Someone had deliberately tried to make it look like Richard had died in that fire. The burned cabin wasn't an accident. It was a setup. The details grew stranger. The fire had been started with accelerants, and there were signs the body had been placed inside after death. Among the ashes, they also found traces of melted plastic consistent with fake identification cards. Whoever orchestrated the scene had been meticulous, almost professional. It was no longer a missing person case. It was a crime. Detectives returned to the insurance records, retracing every step of the paperwork that declared Richard dead. They realized how carefully the documents had been arranged, how every date, signature, and form aligned perfectly. The payout to Elaine looked less like a claim and more like the final step in a plan. Public sympathy for Elaine began to fracture. People who once admired her composure now whispered about her involvement. Reporters flooded Bridgevale again, digging into Richard's company, his financial troubles, and Elaine's sudden wealth. The investigation widened beyond the small town, reaching into nearby counties and connecting with missing persons reports. As each layer peeled away, the image of a tragic disappearance began to look more like a calculated deception. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to fake Richard Hale's death, but who had supplied the body and where had Richard really gone? The perfect illusion was beginning to crack, and what lay behind it was darker than anyone expected. Detectives followed the money first. The mysterious bank transfers Richard had made before his disappearance led them to a name that hadn't appeared in the case before: Mark Denton. He had been a private contractor for Hale Industries, hired for off-site projects and occasional logistics work. On paper, he was unremarkable, a man with no criminal record and little family. But when police tried to locate him, they discovered that Mark Denton had also vanished around the same time Richard did. His home was empty, his truck abandoned, and his bank accounts untouched since the night of Richard's disappearance. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. The more they dug into Mark's background, the more connections they uncovered. He had worked closely with Richard for nearly 2 years and had been seen frequently at Hale Industries in the months leading up to the disappearance. Colleagues remembered him as quiet but watchful, a man who noticed everything but said little. Investigators pulled phone records next, and what they found shifted the entire direction of the case. In the 3 months before Richard went missing, Elaine Hale and Mark Denton had exchanged over 300 calls and dozens of late-night text messages. None of those communications appeared in Elaine's statements to police. When detectives reviewed traffic camera footage from the night Richard disappeared, they discovered something chilling. 15 minutes after Richard's car was last seen driving toward the river, a dark pickup truck, registered to Mark Denton, followed the same route. It was never seen returning. That single image, grainy and distant, connected the missing contractor to the missing businessman and to the calm widow at the center of it all. Investigators built a theory. Richard, Elaine and Mark had conspired together. Richard, drowning in debt, had planned to fake his death to escape financial ruin. Mark, with his skills and access to company equipment, would help arrange the logistics. Elaine, as the beneficiary, would collect the life insurance and later reunite with Richard somewhere far away. It would have been the perfect scheme, if greed hadn't interfered. Evidence began to suggest that Richard had never reached his safe escape. A neighbor near the river reported hearing 2 vehicles late that night, followed by what sounded like shouting. Forensic teams re-examined Richard's car and found faint traces of soil on the tires that matched the area near the burned cabin, 50 miles away. It meant the car had been moved after the supposed disappearance, not before. The deeper detectives looked, the clearer the betrayal became. Elaine and Mark's communications didn't stop after Richard's vanishing. They intensified for several weeks. Financial transfers appeared between their accounts, small but regular, as though they were dividing something. Then suddenly everything stopped. Mark disappeared completely. Elaine stopped using her second phone. 2 years later, an unexpected twist shattered the silence. A man appeared in a small gas station in Arizona, using identification under the name Richard Hale. He looked gaunt and nervous, but when police ran his fingerprints, there was no doubt. Richard Hale was alive. The man Bridgevale had mourned, the husband Elaine had buried, and the businessman everyone believed gone forever had returned. The secret he carried would soon expose the truth behind the crime that was never as perfect as it seemed. When Richard Hale reappeared, the world he left behind was unrecognizable. He walked into a gas station in a remote Arizona town looking thin, sunburned, and unshaven. The clerk recognized his face from an old missing person poster that still hung on a bulletin board and called the police. Within hours, authorities confirmed his identity through fingerprints. The man declared dead 6 years earlier was suddenly alive, and his return reignited a storm of media attention. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where had he been and why had he come back? During questioning, Richard revealed the story piece by piece, his voice steady but hollow. He admitted that his disappearance had not been an accident. He and his wife Elaine had planned everything together. His company had been drowning in debt, and his reputation was on the verge of collapse. Elaine, brilliant and composed, had come up with the idea of faking his death for the insurance payout. Richard had agreed, believing it would give them both a second chance. Mark Denton had been brought in to help. He would find a body, burn it in a remote cabin, and make the scene look convincing. Everything had gone according to plan until the night of the supposed death. According to Richard, after the stage disappearance, he was supposed to meet Elaine and Mark at a cabin to finalize his escape. But when he arrived, something felt wrong. Elaine and Mark were already there, whispering quietly. Their behavior made him uneasy. When he confronted them, Elaine told him coldly that things had changed. She no longer needed him. Before he could react, Mark attacked him. Richard escaped through the woods and ran until dawn, certain they meant to kill him and keep the insurance money for themselves. Fearing capture or worse, he fled the state and began living under false names, taking small jobs and staying far from any place that might recognize him. Detectives were skeptical at first, but his account matched evidence they hadn't yet released. The soil on his car, the burned cabin, and the missing contractor all fit his timeline. When police searched the area near the cabin again, they made a grim discovery: a shallow grave covered by roots and stones. The body inside was identified as Mark Denton. The autopsy showed blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a hammer. The killer had tried to hide him quickly, leaving the ground uneven and disturbed. Elaine Hale was nowhere to be found. Investigators arrived at her luxury home to arrest her, but she had vanished days earlier, leaving behind empty closets and a bank account wiped clean. A single suitcase was missing. Some believed she had been tipped off that Richard was alive and had fled the country before her arrest. Others speculated she might have met her own violent end, silenced by someone who knew too much. Richard's confession turned the story of a perfect disappearance into a tale of betrayal and greed. The plan had been flawless on paper. No witnesses, no body, no question. But human nature had undone it. Greed, jealousy, and fear left behind the cracks that ultimately exposed everything. Bridgevale never forgot the case. It became a haunting legend of how deception always consumes its creators. Even now, years later, Elaine's whereabouts remain unknown. Some claim to have seen her under a new name in distant countries, always looking over her shoulder. Others believe her story ended long ago, buried in the same quiet woods where her crimes began. The perfect crime she had built so carefully collapsed under the weight of her own ambition, proving that even the most brilliant lies can never stay buried forever.